Real stories of werewolves, of dogmen from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories. Whether you call him Bigfoot or Sasquatch, you know one thing for certain. That mofo doesn't like Dogman. So get ready for one full hour of werewolves battling ape men. And it all begins right now.
Werewolf beats Bigfoot. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I saw a fight between a Bigfoot and a werewolf. I think the one creature was a Bigfoot, and I know the second one was a werewolf, not a dogman. How do I know? Because sometime after that creature bit the Bigfoot, I saw the Bigfoot become sick and transform into a hideous canine version of his former self. How else to explain that, except to say that I think I saw that Sasquatch get turned into a werewolf. I really don't love using those words to describe what I saw, since neither of them really looked at all like what I would have expected a Sasquatch or a werewolf to look like. I just think that must have been what they were. But I'll get into details and try to explain what it is that I was looking at, so that you'll know what I mean when I use those sorts of generic terms. These were very specific creatures, different from what I've seen in movies or on TV. So I was camping with my friend who I will call Jeremy. He and I used to be roommates in college, and we've stayed drinking buddies and occasional camping buddies since then. I've just turned 27, so I guess he and I have been friends since we were both 18. We met as freshmen. Now, this cryptid stuff happened during the pandemic, so what year was that? I don't even remember. It was an election year, probably. So, we were both adults, out of school and working jobs for a few years by this point. Jeremy is the taller of the two of us, and back then he was more athletic. When the gyms were closed during the pandemic, he kinda got out of the habit of exercising, and these days I'm probably in better shape than he is. But back then, he was still in shape and still confident, and still making good money and dating different women. I hadn't really seen him look scared before, when he came running out of the woods in the late afternoon, saying he had seen a big Sasquatch-looking guy out in the woods, staring at him while he was trying to pee. He told me he couldn't pee once he saw it, and I made a crack about how I'd pee my pants if I saw what he saw. I guess that was rude, but I thought he was joking around. Like I said, I had never seen him look scared before, and he was bigger than me. I thought this was Jeremy putting on his "oh, I'm so scared" act. I thought he was pulling my leg to try to get me scared, so I just made fun of him. But it turned out he really meant it, so all of a sudden I was apologizing and Jeremy was getting all emotional, like some emo girl. I'm not trying to be rude, I just want you to understand how surprising this was. Like he went into the woods one person and came out someone else. So as I was apologizing and trying to get my friend to calm down, I began thinking about how scary that thing must have looked if it could turn my big brave friend Jeremy into a blubbering idiot with just one glance. I got the full body shivers from that. And so Jeremy and I started drinking the beers a little early. Why we didn't pack up and try somewhere else, I'm not sure. But we drank some beers and built up a big roaring fire. After we got some food in our bellies, we didn't feel so scared anymore, at least I didn't. When I realized I had to pee, I just got up and wandered away from the fire into the darkness. I wasn't thinking about forest monsters or anything like that at all. I had moved past all that stuff already. But as I was zipping up after doing my duty, I got that feeling of being watched. I looked all around. When I saw red eyes at about 11 o'clock, looking like they were a head or two above me off the ground, I did not think Sasquatch. Honestly, I had first thought shadow person because all I saw at first was the dark silhouette and the bright red eyes. But when the dark figure got angry at me staring at it, then it began to charge toward me, and I saw that it was not a flat silhouette at all, but a three-dimensional creature of some sort, and even larger than I had originally thought. I turned and ran toward the 4 o'clock position when our camp was at 6 o'clock, so that was a huge mistake on my part to start with. It's a lucky break for you, though, because my idiocy is the only reason I got to witness the stuff that I'm about to recall for you. So I ran through the woods in the dark, pretty wasted if I'm going to be honest, and I kept running into tree branches and slipping and falling on my face as I ran. At points I was crawling, and I was a banged up, muddy mess almost as soon as the chase through the dark began. All of this on top of the fact that I had no idea where I was running to in the dark woods. I could hear that guy behind me growling like an animal, so I didn't feel like turning around and having a conversation with my pursuer was really much of an option, if you know what I mean. I might have started to figure out that this was the Bigfoot that got Jeremy so scared earlier, but I'm not sure my thinking at that time was really as complex as all that. I was just scared for my life. As I was heading toward a clearing that was better lit than where I was, presumably by moonlight since what else was there, I saw another figure in that clearing, directly in front of me. It seemed to be facing in my direction and waiting to intercept me. I thought I was running into a trap, and I suppose I was, but I thought the figure behind me was deliberately chasing me toward the figure in front. I thought they were working in cahoots, and that I was about to be eaten for a late dinner by whatever these two figures were. This was not actually the case, but it was my instinctual gut reaction at the time, and my nervous system was overruling my conscious mind. I turned to my left at the last second, heading on a parallel course to the edge of the clearing instead of entering it. I was staying in the dark woods, hoping my pursuer would miss what I had done, and continue running forward into the clearing. While I was making my getaway to the left, I got my foot hooked under a root, and I fell face forward, really wrenching my foot and ankle, bending them in ways God had not intended them to be bent. Nothing was broken, but I was in severe blinding pain for a few seconds, and running was going to be out of the question for at least a few minutes, probably longer. Instead, I got my foot up on a rock and I turned to peer through the vegetation into the clearing. In there I saw not a shadow man, not a Sasquatch, and not a human, but some kind of a dog-headed man or dogman, I suppose. It was in the clearing waiting for me. That was what I had seen in there ahead of me before I took off to the left. But when my pursuer burst out into the woods, it was not another dog-headed man. It was a big, dark muscle man of a creature, entirely covered in fur. Its eyes were red, and this had to have been what chased me. It was not a shadow man because it was three-dimensional, but I wasn't sure what it was. I guess it was ape-like, but not really. It was like a big, hairy man, a sort of a small giant, I guess. Maybe a caveman? It wasn't a human, and it wasn't an ape. So it had to have been a Bigfoot, but I never expected Bigfoot to look quite like this guy. Neither the so-called Sasquatch nor the, I guess you'd call it a dogman, seemed to have expected the other one. In fact, they both backed away from each other in an almost comical fashion at first. I'm not sure which one was more scared of the other, but they sure weren't friends or working together. It was clear that the Bigfoot had not intentionally chased me toward that thing. So after initially reacting to each other like Abbott and Costello, their next reaction was not so humorous. The two creatures began circling each other, clearly intending to fight. I was stuck where I was, massaging my foot, and wishing I either had a camera with me or some means of transportation out of there. It seemed I'd hurt myself right on the borderline between Bigfoot turf and werewolf turf, judging by the attitude both of them were bringing into this fight. It didn't look to me like either one was bluffing, even though they were literally bluffing. I saw the wolf charge the gorilla-looking man, and I saw the Squatch do the same to the wolfman. But it was clear with every movement either one made that they were testing the other, measuring the abilities of their opponent. In that sense, they really weren't bluff charges. They were more like reconnaissance missions and information-gathering expeditions. These were two predators who usually took down herbivores, I would imagine. Everything I have ever heard about this type of situation indicated that predators will avoid violent conflict with each other under nearly all circumstances. I was sitting there watching the exception. I was watching a real Bigfoot and a real dogman battle, or so I thought. At first, the Squatch scored more direct hits than the upright wolf, but I'm not sure he was really able to do much damage. If you think of the creature as a dogman, that doesn't really make too much sense. But if he was a werewolf, well, don't they have some kind of healing ability? If we assume this was a werewolf and not a dogman, then maybe he was letting the Bigfoot hit him. This way the Squatch does his worst damage and tires himself out, but the werewolf keeps withdrawing and giving his body time to heal before taking another attack from the Bigfoot. The Sasquatch's attacks were all blunted pummeling, like he sort of punched the wolf at one point, and he backhanded him another time. I saw him grab the wolf and throw him into a tree as well. The wolf mostly darted around and snarled while the Squatch tired himself out. Both creatures spent as much time on two legs as four, attacking each other from left, right, above, and below. It was pretty amazing to see their abilities, but I couldn't forget that this wasn't some kind of athletic display. This was a blood fight for real. Once the Bigfoot started slowing down a bit, I saw that wolfman start to finally get serious. But his style of fighting was different from the Sasquatch. The dogman was all slashing claws and biting jaws. I could tell when the Bigfoot connected by the thudding sound, but I could tell when the werewolf connected because the Bigfoot would let out a high-pitched yelp, like a dog whose tail you just stepped on. The werewolf would do these chaotic attacks, sometimes running past the Bigfoot at full speed, then darting away, but other times slashing and biting as he continued to run at full speed. After a few direct hits, the werewolf seemed to withdraw for longer periods than earlier, watching the Bigfoot, looking for something. What was he looking for? All I know is that when he didn't see it, he ran in for another few anarchistic dive bomb attacks against his larger opponent. After some time, the Bigfoot seemed to be having issues. He was slower to react when the dogman ran past for one thing, but he also seemed to be having some kind of a problem of some sort. It kind of looked like he was sick. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. He seemed like he was going to vomit, but he didn't. Then he started to have some kind of spasmodic attack, flinging himself all around the clearing and making a horrible racket. He crashed off balance into a tree all the way on my side of the clearing at one point, and I had leaves and branches rained all over me. I almost had an attack of my own when that happened, but the Squatch staggered back over to the other side in a second or two. The werewolf seemed to be expecting all this, and he seemed to be enjoying himself, as far as I could tell. The twitchy, gyrating Bigfoot started to look different. His snout seemed longer than it had before, and his ears seemed less like those of a monkey than they had before too. It wouldn't have been something I would have ever even thought about before, but I was seeing the Bigfoot monster become a werewolf version of itself. Its legs looked different, and the changes seemed to be painful to endure, judging by the sounds his werewolf Bigfoot was making. When he dropped to his knees and howled, the werewolf joined him, and the two howled to the heavens for what seemed to my eardrums to be 6 or 7 years, but was probably in actuality only 3 or 4 months. I started to shake all over, and I couldn't control it. I still don't know what that was about, but at the time, I thought it was some kind of serious physical problem. I mean, I thought I was gonna die, so I laid down and I tried to slow my breathing. It turns out that was a good thing to do because I was probably having a panic attack. Breathing like you're calm will help you get calm again. I didn't know that. I just got lucky. And I kept lying on that cold forest ground, trying to calm myself down, focusing on breathing slowly and deeply, when I suddenly noticed that the sky I was staring up at was starting to turn purple and pink. I also realized that I hadn't heard monster noises for a long time. and I started to feel a little more normal again. My foot and ankle were still sore, but I felt a lot less scared in the morning light with no monsters. So I started to hobble and hop back to camp. Jeremy had not noticed I was gone, but he noticed my limp when I came back to camp. I told him it was the Bigfoot who gave me the limp, but now the Bigfoot is a werewolf, and he thought I had eaten some strange mushrooms. I ate some food, then went to sleep in my tent. I didn't get up till noonish, and when I did, I told Jeremy we had to pack and leave. He still thought I was tripping out, so I had to prove to him that I was just tired, not stoned or whatever. I told him the entire story, and even though he was the one who had seen the Bigfoot first, he acted like he didn't believe my story. I guess Bigfoot seemed real to him, but not werewolves? Or no, it was that he could accept a dogman, but not a werewolf. He says a dogman could be real, but transforming mythical creatures are impossible. Now, that's kind of an insulting thing to say to a guy who just saw a Bigfoot transform into a werewolf. Or a were-squatch? A werefoot. Anyway, in the time since then, Jeremy says he's come to accept that I really mean it about this story, and he no longer suspects I was on some weird fungus from outer space or anything. But he has tried to get me to go back to this park to camp on several occasions, and I think he's out of his mind. He says the chances of seeing a cryptid in the same location twice in one lifetime are almost zero. But he keeps forgetting one key fact. I didn't just see a Bigfoot. I saw a werewolf. It was able to turn that Squatch into something else. And that means it could do the same to me or to any human as well. I don't personally want to become a werewolf. And I don't want to be camping with Jeremy when he gets turned into a werewolf either. I'd rather spend my time off in places less known for monsters that turn you into monsters. I'm taking my next vacation in my bathtub. I'm hoping my skin doesn't pucker too much, but in either case, it's better than worrying about becoming a cursed, hairy monster.
If you want a coloring book full of monstrous delight, then give this a look. It'll give you a fright, right? Scary stories, coloring book, werewolf coloring book. And just to make your mind explode, it's a digital download. All it costs is $2.09, and then you will be feeling fine. Coloring monsters today, hey, it's a coloring book, hooray. Okay, link is in the description.
Dogman versus the six-fingered swamp booger. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Hey, I saw a cryptid fight once a long time ago. I'd like to tell you the story, and I haven't told it on YouTube before. If you don't use it, tell me so I can send it somewhere else. But if you do use it, feel free to fix it up or correct the grammar, but don't change the parts about the monsters. Or if you do need to change things, let me see them first, and let me okay it before you record the show. Even though I'm not going to put my name on it at the request of my daughter, I still want to make sure the details are gotten correct. Now, the two cryptids I saw having a fight of some kind about 15 or 20 years ago were a Bigfoot and a dogman or werewolf, or something that looked like a dogman or werewolf at least. Both creatures stood up like men, and neither one was playing around when they were arguing. It was some kind of very serious fight, and they didn't seem to like each other in the slightest. Both of them wanted to hurt the other one, but each of them also clearly had a healthy fear of the other, and so they spent the majority of the event screaming, posturing, and throwing things from a relatively safe distance, before tempers started to flare even hotter than that previous boiling point. I can also tell you pretty much exactly where my sighting took place, because it started off with me and two of my buddies trying to scare each other by going up to a crybaby bridge. Now, I don't think this is a real crybaby bridge. I just made it up to scare the other two, because I had the keys to my parents' car that night, and it was a winter vacation night, so we could stay up late. My two friends, who I will call Nestor and Lester, were 17, as I was, and they were all sleeping over at our place, while my parents slept over at their friend's party. Now, I had never asked for permission to go legend tripping looking for ghosts. I know that my parents left me the older car so that I could get food and in case of an emergency, not for joyriding. But they never specifically said that we couldn't go looking for ghosts under a bridge, so I said, let's go have some fun. Where Walsh Road goes over Arms Creek, that's where I decided there would be a legend attached of a woman who lost her baby there to the tide back years ago when it was a wooden-covered bridge. Now, I don't actually know if it ever was a wood-covered bridge, but I bet there used to be a wooden bridge there, so the story made sense to me. But when we got to the spot, Nestor and Lester were disappointed and skeptical. They asked where the bridge was, and I pointed to the creek going under the road. Nestor was like, "That's not a bridge. That's a road going over a creek." Lester pointed out that a road going over a creek is by definition a bridge, and Nestor had no wind left in his sails. Still, neither of them found a road going over a creek to be scary, even there in the woods in the middle of the night. Nestor said he was expecting some kind of larger body of water. That didn't look to him like it was enough water to drown a fly, let alone someone's brat. But we all soon quieted down when we started to hear very soft sounds that seemed as though they might be much louder sounds if we were closer to them. Not sounds of a crying baby. These were percussive sounds. You could feel them in the soles of your feet. It felt like something terrible was happening somewhere off in that forest. Shutting up, we all wandered over toward the woodline, listening to an awful and arrhythmic combination of deep percussive sounds which seemed to be getting progressively louder. We started quietly arguing about what that tearing sound was that we were hearing, when Nestor pointed at the sight of the tops of tall trees in the distance, swaying violently, and a cloud of dust rising from out there. The three of us turned to run away, just as the woods exploded open, one tree getting partially uprooted, as two big dark monsters scrambled out of the woods, running over and past us, as we feebly attempted to run away from them. 1 second they were behind us, the next they were over us, and then off they went into the woods on the other side of the road, each trying to hurt the other one, both of them seeming to be simultaneously the attacker and the prey being pursued. I saw one chasing the other. Then he ran right past him and was suddenly being chased. It was the most manic and insane conflict I've ever witnessed. And I once attended WrestleMania in person, so I know all about live fighting events. This was the biggest one of all time, or at least the two fighters were the biggest any of the three of us had ever seen going at it. So my two friends and I ran off into the woods after this insanity, which I still can't believe each time I think back on it. I certainly wouldn't do that again if it happened now. But we were 17, unmarried, no jobs, and we didn't have to get up the next morning. So somehow, we just wanted to see more of what those two big monsters were that ran past us. Now, each of the two of them was a different kind of a monster. We could see that right away. But they were both bigger than bears, and they both had such long legs. It was hard to believe there could be two different kinds of things like that in the world, when we had never thought of anything like that before. I forget if it was Nestor or Lester that called one of them a Bigfoot, and a light went off over my head. It was more like a man than the other one. What would you call that one with the tall ears? I remember asking nobody in particular, and both of my friends immediately said that was the Michigan Dogman. Like, they both already had a context to understand what was happening, while I was still at the stage of wondering what I was looking at. And it made sense. Their framework, I mean. The one must be a Bigfoot, and the other must be a Dogman. Suddenly what was happening was defined, and made sense, even though it really only opened up more questions, because then you gotta ask, well, what is a Bigfoot? And what really is a Dogman? Because apparently I saw one of each, and I can't tell you for certain what that was that I saw. I'm certain I saw them fighting though. The three of us ran as hard as we could after the creatures, who had to be more than twice our size. The only reason we saw them at all though, was because they stopped and fought in a clearing. If they had kept running, they would have been out of our range in under a minute, because their legs were so long, and they were so incredibly powerful and fast. That's another thing I mentioned earlier in passing, but I really should go back to and emphasize. These things were all legs, and they also had very long arms. Although they were mainly what I would call bipedal or upright, I do remember seeing them scrambling around on the ground under each other at points. They were not above crawling if it got the job done, just as they were not above violence when scare tactics failed, if you catch my drift. I never really saw two fighters of any species who seemed both more frightened of or angrier at each other. There were points where one or the other clearly could have made a break for it and run off, yet neither ever did. We stopped to catch our breaths at one point, while the two big smelly behemoths pummeled each other with fists that looked awfully human to me. Especially the big skinny Bigfoot, who was more human than I expected a Sasquatch to be. The thing is, had Lester noticed this first, his hands seemed to have too many fingers. It looked to me like 6 fingers on each hand, and by that I mean 5 fingers and 1 thumb on each. It might have even been 7, but we all agreed that night that he had 6 fingers. It was dark, so it might have been an illusion. But is that part really so much harder to believe than any of the rest of this? Something about the 6-fingered part hit a chord with me, and I did look into it a little bit. There are stories of giants with 6 fingers in various old world traditions, including the Bible. I don't recall them being described as covered in black fur as this creature we were witnessing was, but I wonder if Bigfoot might be descended from some of these giants, or if maybe they both had a common ancestor possibly. I guess it also might have been a fluke or a mutation that gave him the polydactylism, as I think they call it. At least that's what my mom used to say about her cat, that it had polydactylism with too many fingers. The thing is, my mom's cat's paws looked wrong. This Bigfoot's hands looked fine and not malformed. They just had 1 extra finger on each hand. I wonder if we could have looked in his mouth if we would have seen double rows of teeth, like they talk about in the old stories of giants. By the way, those giant legends are not limited to Europe and the Middle East. There are American legends of giants that were told to the Europeans when they arrived. These 6-fingered big guys seem to have gotten around, even if we don't know where they've gone to more recently. Some people do suggest that they may have devolved into the kind of ugly mud-covered swamp booger that we were seeing holding his own against that equally giant dog-headed kind of monster that was trying to tear the Squatch's neck right open. I ran what I've written so far past Nestor and Lester, and they both insist that these monsters were 14 or 15 feet tall. Now that just looks stupid when I see it typed out. Nothing is that tall. Nothing. They must have been more like 11 or 12 feet tall, since that just sounds more logical to me in my head. I mean, who would believe me if I said 14 or 15 feet tall? But I do remember them being taller than any kind of land animal I can think of. Well, I guess maybe an elephant is taller than they were. But what walks on two legs and gets that tall? Absolutely nothing does. In either case, we could have ducked and run between either monster's legs, so they were very tall, and they were very leggy. In the booger's sense, I'd say that sort of gave him the look of a basketball player with a bad temper and a lot of mud all over him. The dogman or werewolf, on the other hand, was all swole, like a steroid freak. He looked like he could bench press Cleveland and use Earth's moon as a medicine ball. He had muscles that would make Schwarzenegger go wow. I don't know that he was actually any stronger or faster than the Bigfoot, but he sure looked more impressive to the eye in that sense. He looked like he was ready for a fight, whereas the Bigfoot looked like he was ready to hide behind a tree and peek out at someone. I guess the different survival strategies led to different body builds. So I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but there was a long period of them circling each other and faking each other out, before all of a sudden, bam! Both sides were snarling and baring teeth and going for each other's throats in this really scary frenzy that even made me and my two friends turn around and find spots at a safer distance to watch from. The dogman had been more inclined to tear at the Bigfoot with his claws than punch with his fists, as the Sasquatch seemed to prefer. But suddenly at that moment, any trace of humanity was stripped from that Bigfoot, and he bit at the other monster's throat as if he had never been anything more than an animal in the first place. The wolfman tried to tear the Sasquatch's eyes out, but the Bigfoot grabbed him by both wrists and squeezed them hard, forcing the dogman down onto his knees in front of him. The Bigfoot got 3 successive sharp knees to the face in before the surprised dogman was able to react by snapping at his legs, scoring 2 bites before the next knee caught him square in the snout, losing at least one of his teeth from his jaw, sending it flying. Seizing the advantage, the Bigfoot leaped on top of the canine creature and seemed to be pummeling him, possibly for the final time. The 3 of us cautiously creeped a little closer, having a hard time seeing what was happening beyond the ever-growing dust cloud that the fight was generating. Suddenly there was a squeal or a howl that almost deafened me, as one of those animals was in extreme pain. We couldn't even tell which one it was, but we were too scared to move forward into the smoky area, knowing that the visibility in there was down to almost nothing. We didn't have to worry for long though, as soon the fight brought itself to us. Out of the trees burst the Sasquatch, making that noise again. The dogman had scored a blow back there, although I don't know exactly what happened. The Bigfoot seemed to want to get away. He had finally had enough. It looked as though he was going to run past us to our right, but the dogman leaped and grabbed him from behind, with the altered momentum, sending both monsters careening off balance, directly toward where the 3 of us had been watching. I remember time slowing down, and I remember feeling like it was 9/11, and one of the towers was falling behind me. I was running, and I couldn't look back, because the entire building was going to collapse on top of me if I did. When the monsters fell on top of each other behind me, it sounded like slow-motion sound effects to me. I saw my 2 friends in front of me turn to look back, but I just kept running past them until I tripped and fell down, gasping for air. Now the 2 monsters were on the ground on top of each other, rolling and rolling as dust rose up and made it harder to breathe than to see, which wasn't easy. We were coughing violently now, and so we were no longer able to disguise our positions to the creatures. We all ran as well as we could, coughing and retching and gasping for oxygen, as we continued to try to get away from the epicenter of all this insanity. I could hear the dogman's growls, and I could hear the Sasquatch's exclamations of pain, sounding almost human, but not quite. It was a terrible thing to be hearing, and it made me feel nauseous, and like I had to go to the bathroom. Lester shouted, "There's the car," and my eyes lit up. I had forgotten that we had a car. I had forgotten we were in the 21st century. I think I must have been in some state of trauma or shock or something. But when I saw my parents' old beat-up heap parked on the grass near that little bridge overpass, it felt like Christmas times 12. I jumped in and started the engine, and I almost backed over Lester, who hadn't gotten inside yet. Rather than apologize, I shouted at him to move faster, and we got the heck out of Dodge while we could. The two of them were in the back seat, and they were claiming they could see the dust cloud from the road. It was a bright night, so maybe they really could. Stuff like this only could happen on a full moon night, or something close to the full moon. Not only does it make it light enough for something like this to go on, but that moon makes the animals and the people alike just a little bit more high-strung. It's like giving everybody 6 cups of coffee to start their evening off with, you know? I made my friends swear to me that they wouldn't tell my parents or anyone where we went or what we did on that night. In fact, we stopped to get some food on the way back just so that I could at least explain some of the mileage we put on that old crate. I could already imagine the kind of lecture I would get for doing the kind of things we did on that night, and I don't ever want to hear that lecture in real life. And how could I defend leaving my parents' car parked along the side of the forest road at night, just because I felt like running into the woods to see Dogman versus the 6-fingered swamp booger?
The summer's over, face of deer. It's that hoodie time of year, and you know times are never dull when you got the hoodie with the scary skull. Scary skull. Scary skull. Scary skull. Hoodie, scody, skull. Hoodie, skull. Scary skull. Pull over hoodie. Wear it till spring, it's a goodie. You can buy it without a prescription. Just follow the link in this video's description.
Savage, Dogman, Sasquatch feud. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was young, I grew up accepting as fact that not only were both Bigfoot and Dogman real, but they both had clans which were warring on the land behind my family's property. The stories go back to long before I was born. I'll give you my version of the family's history with these 2 giant battling cryptids, although I'll probably forget a lot of parts. There are so many different anecdotes about both creatures. Sometimes someone in the family would just see one creature or the other from a distance, but other times quite involved dramas took place, which the family unwillingly got swept up into. Our family home was in Brockway, Pennsylvania, but not in the town proper. We had a house in the woods to the north and west of there. It was impossible to get anything delivered directly to us, so we were always having to go into town to collect our mail at the post office. None of my friends had to live like that, and they would all remind me of this fact whenever they could. It was hard to get any kids who weren't weird to want to come visit me at home, so I usually only had 1 or 2 really good friends at any one time. When I was 16 and 17, though, I had a friend we'll call Brian, who loved to stay over because he was so into cryptids. Back then we just called them monsters. I had always thought of the monsters behind our property in the way you might regard a family of bears living on your land. I was afraid of them, and I wanted to avoid them. Brian had an entirely different perspective. He didn't grow up in the woods. He grew up watching In Search Of on TV. And he grew up being told by his parents that Bigfoot and werewolves are not really out there in the darkness. To me, He was a weirdo, but I didn't really have any other friends, so I guess that made me a weirdo too. It wasn't my place to judge the other weirdos, since I was the one living in the woods with Dogman. So Brian caused me to become interested in this subject that I had grown up being bored and annoyed by. How can a kid be bored by monster stories? If they all start off with, "You'd better be a good boy and always obey your elders because monsters," then your mind, ears, and imagination are turned off before the story even begins. To me, monster stories were not cool, scary anecdotes narrated by Mr. Spock on TV. To me, monster stories were nagging, hectoring lectures imposed upon me by older relatives while I was trying to watch TV. Brian got himself invited to my family's events whenever a relative he hadn't met yet was visiting. He had one of those old-school handheld cassette tape recorders with a weird little tiny microphone that he would hold in front of my relatives' mouths as they talked, and he would interview them about their monster experiences. He'd wait till later in the evening when they got, loosened up and relaxed before asking them to tell their stories. And they'd often go on, talking about the old days, not just the parts about cryptids, but all of it. I had an Aunt Ellen who had a creepy Dogman encounter that almost got her injured, or worse. She was driving east or south on Game School Road, which is a little two-lane highway that leads north and west out of town. It was dark out, and there are no lights on that road, so Aunt Ellen said she knew she should have been being more careful. There's woodland on either side, and there's nothing to prevent an animal, or even a person, from walking out into the road right in front of your vehicle. There was no traffic out that night, though, so Aunt Ellen had a growing, but false, sense of security. So that scenario I just described of the animal jumping out in front of the car actually happened, but Aunt Ellen said it was something that looked like a werewolf. When it ran out onto the road, it did it in such a way as to give the impression that it had been waiting there for her for some time. It had clawed hands in front of itself, in much the way a monster from the movies would do it. It seemed to be trying to be frightening, and Aunt Ellen said that when she panicked and swerved to avoid hitting it, the creature got this look on his monstrous face that appeared to her to be some sort of evil grin or smirk. The front end of Aunt Ellen's car crashed into a tree, wrecking it and causing her to lose consciousness for a few minutes. When she woke up, she couldn't see the Dogman anywhere, but she didn't presume that meant he was gone. Now, obviously, those were the days before cell phones, so Aunt Ellen had to get out of that vehicle and walk to a telephone. Doing the math in her head and not remembering any nearby gas stations or public phone booths, she figured she may as well walk home and use the phone there. Aunt Ellen said she was preoccupied with making sure she wasn't seriously injured as she took her first few tentative steps onto the road, testing her feet, her ankles, her legs, and finding them in basically good working order. As she began her long trek in the very dark night through the even darker woods, Aunt Ellen said she could hear twigs snapping and something moving somewhere in the darkness, just out of her range of vision. When she stopped moving, the sounds stopped as well, and when she started moving again, the creepy sounds resumed. The entire walk home, she felt like someone or something was about to pounce on her. At one point, she told Brian that she called out to whoever was in the woods, asking him or her or it to just finish her off already. And if he, she, or it was just trying to scare her, then he should go do something to himself that I won't repeat here. She said the sounds stopped, and she went home, called AAA from her landline, then laid down on a couch downstairs in her house by a window looking out onto the dark backyard. Aunt Ellen said she closed her eyes for a few minutes to rest them, and then she heard a tapping at the window pane. Sitting up surprised, she told me that she saw glowing animal eyeshine outside in the darkness, staring back in at her. My friend Brian was able to get different kinds of cryptid encounter anecdotes out of my family, different from the cautionary kind they told to me to cause me to find monsters annoying. In the stories that Brian collected, a picture was painted of two kinds of cryptids whose behavior seemed to have a certain consistency to it. The dogman seemed more interested in scaring people and causing panic or disaster than behaving like a conventional canine or even a conventional predator. The Bigfoot, on the other hand, seemed to divide his time between peeking out from behind trees at people or engaging in turf battles with the dogman. My grandfather on my mother's side, Grandpa Joe, told Brian a story about seeing one Bigfoot barge in on a pack of dogmen that he had been tracking and spying on. Grandpa Joe was a hunter, and he had a number of wild stories about fighting with bears and cougars, but his most amazing story of all was the Bigfoot Dogman turf battle of 1957. So there had been a family that started to build a house in the woods behind where Grandpa lived. For some reason, the house was abandoned, half-finished, and the family disappeared out of that area. Grandpa had gotten into the habit of going back there in the woods and salvaging parts of the place to use for repairs on his own house. One late afternoon as he approached the property, he noticed other figures moving about in the distance. Hiding himself and watching, Grandpa Joe was stunned to see a pack of large dogs, all milling about on their hind legs, walking like human beings. Grandpa had never seen these creatures before, but he had heard his neighbors talk about the Pennsylvania werewolf. He just thought they were crazy old drunkards, but maybe they took to drink to cope with the trauma of encountering the kinds of creatures that Grandpa Joe was eyeballing from his hiding spot. He was trying to understand what they were doing because, to be honest, from a distance, it looked like they were rummaging around for things to scavenge for home repairs. Same thing that he was doing. Without the slightest bit of warning, a huge Sasquatch, much larger than any of the dogmen, leaped into the scene screaming like he was Tarzan or something. In one hand, he held a plank of wood he had picked up from the debris. Was he repairing his home as well? No, he was swinging for the fences, wildly trying to bash the dogmen on their dog heads. The canines were not as tall and did not appear as strong either, but they had speed and agility on their side, and they were able to dance around the Bigfoot, snapping at him from multiple sides, while he kept narrowly missing, crushing their skulls. The dogmen learned quickly to make their attack and retreat fast. That Bigfoot had canine teeth, just as large as any possessed by the canine animals. In other words, his fangs were no less impressive or terrifying than the dog's fangs. Brian pressed Grandpa Joe to put a number to the height of the various creatures, and he thought about it. Well, he said there was about 2 feet difference when they were close together. So if the dogman was 5.5 feet tall, then the Squatch was 7.5. I'd guess that the dogmen were more my height, though, and I'm a half inch under 6 feet. That would make the Bigfoot maybe 8 feet, maybe taller than that. Grandpa said he knew it sounded crazy, but that was why he avoided talking about the height until he was directly questioned. So that Bigfoot was outnumbered, but he swung his plank of wood around vigorously, battling as if the fate of the world depended on him winning. The dogs would snap at him, and he would snap right back at them. It seemed inevitable that the dogman would overtake that Bigfoot, when suddenly Grandpa insisted that the entire forest exploded in angry, howling sounds, and from 5 or 6 different directions at once. Huge Bigfoot, even larger than the one already in the battle, raced forward. One of them ran past Grandpa Joe, maybe only 12 or 15 feet away. The battle had escalated to pure savage fury. My grandfather said he looked at what was happening and felt certain that there were going to be lives lost in this incident he was witnessing. In order to keep his own name off that list, my Grandpa Joe said he turned around and ran home, tail between his legs. That was the last time he scavenged anything from that half-finished house. For the first time, he had a guess as to why that family abandoned the prospect of living back there. That was the year Grandpa installed taller fencing around the back of the property. Most of the cautionary tales told to me as a child stemmed from that incident. There were monsters in those woods. These were violent and angry monsters. They were so violent and so angry that they didn't just want to eat up little boys, but they wanted to eat up each other too. This was an undercurrent of horror in the background of my childhood, but since I never wanted to go in the woods anyway, it never became a big deal to me, like it seemed to be for my friend Brian. Speaking of Brian, he was constantly trying to get me to take him for a walk in those woods, as if I were a tour guide or something. I had no idea what went on inside those trees. I stayed in the house, or at most the backyard. There was nothing Brian could do or say to get me to take one step inside that forest. Until, one day, Brian brought over two really attractive young women our age, who were both big fans of the Bigfoot. They gave me the whole treatment, which at that age I was unused to. I had never received so much positive attention from female humans in all of my entire life as I received from those two beautiful young women on that late afternoon, and so I weakened, and then I buckled. When Brian wanted me to walk in the woods, I knew nothing about them. Once these two girls asked, well, then I was an expert on that forest. I knew it like the back of my hand, sure. Into the woods we went, and we were almost immediately lost. It was just as quick as that. It felt like we'd been walking for 90 seconds before each of the four of us were completely turned around. The girls were getting very antsy, and Brian was making things worse by mocking their fear. I thought you ladies wanted to see monsters, he taunted them. You're scared of shadows. What'll you do if real monsters show up? And not right then, not on cue, but really just a minute or two later, this freaking dog-headed monkey man pounced out at the girls, making them scream and run into my arms and Brian's. The thing is, that dog man, he wasn't acting like he wanted to capture the girls. He wasn't behaving like he wanted to eat them. He was acting more like a fake monster in a scary dark ride at an amusement park. It was like he was jumping out and saying boo, more than behaving like a normal predator. When I saw him make the girls scream, that was my impression of what had just happened. He was trying to scare, not to maim or kill. Why would he be trying to do that? Well, no matter why, the creature, who was the size of a normal man, around 6 feet or so, growled and walked around us. I didn't realize at first, but he seemed to be herding us into one spot. What would happen when he was finished with that? I was not looking forward to finding out. I looked around for something I could use as a weapon, like Captain Kirk fighting the Gorn. I was pretty frightened, but I was also the one who grew up with stories of those creatures as part of my everyday life. I had never seen a dogman before, but I was still the most used to what they were supposed to be like. I knew it wanted us scared, and something about that gave me a sense of bravery. Nevertheless, I am not Captain Kirk, and I came up with no miracle solutions to our problem. The dogman herded us up against this impenetrable patch of trees, and as it walked over to us on its hind legs, its sharp claws and teeth looking every bit like those of a meat-eating creature, I began to question my theory that the dogman lives off of our fear. Maybe he just enjoys our fear before he feasts on our flesh and on our blood. There were 4 of us and 1 of him, and he was only our size. I tried to think of a way to fight him, but somehow it just seemed impossible. I began to wonder how bad this next part was gonna be. when two trees were parted forcefully, and out charged what I at first took to be an immense bull gorilla. This creature was way too tall to be a gorilla, though. It was taller than a bear. It also didn't have that pot belly that gorillas tend to have, and it stood up straighter and taller. It had fangs like a gorilla, though, and it showed them off as it roared so loudly that it hurt my ears. The dogman now had something more important to attend to, so we were ignored, and we took off running away. The Bigfoot was picking up rocks and sometimes just clumps of dirt and hurling them at the face of that dogman. The last thing I saw was the ape man tackling the canine, and the two of them knocking a grown tree completely down as they fell hard into it. The four of us ran away, not really knowing where we were heading, until one of the girls spotted my family's house through the woods. The Bigfoot had sent us running in the correct direction, so we got lucky on that late afternoon. Well, now I can say I've been inside the forest behind the house, I told myself. Scratch that off the bucket list. It's something I never need to do again, and a place I never need to visit ever. So my family sold the house while I was in college, but the activity had seemed to stop before then anyhow. We got the impression that both species had developed different places to habituate during the summer. I was in Pennsylvania just a couple months ago, meeting up with an old friend from junior high school, and she told me she knew the current owner of my family's former house. She took me by to introduce me, and wow, all the memories just flooded back, you know. Looking out at those woods behind that property still gave me a chill. The current owner, at one point, got a weird look on his face, and he asked me confidentially if he could ask a personal question. When that question turned out to be that he wanted to know if I believed in Bigfoot, I knew the habituation had not truly ended. The activity must have just quieted down for a while, but never fully gone away. In answer, I asked that man if he believed in Dogman, and judging by the reaction on his face, nothing in that area had actually changed at all. It continues to be the ongoing era of the savage Dogman Sasquatch feud.
More bigger than a waffle on your plate. A waffle on your head could be just great. It's the waffle bee from NYC. Scary fashion for spring, you see. Black, birch, camel, navy, rust, or heather gray. One of these colors is just your way. Wear this hat and you'll be it. Link in the description for this vid. Get your own scary stories, waffle beanie today. Thank you, Stell Curd Logo, for all the things you do. We thank you, and moreover, we want to say thank you. Thank you to our executive producer, Stell. She is the best, hooray!
Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos, or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LASCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.